This is Michael Flores with Checkmate Turbine Pest in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and you're listening to the world's #1 pest control training podcast, the Pest Geek Podcast with Frank Hernandez.
Pull out your hose and grab your can. We're about to integrate another Pest Geek podcast. Hi, everybody. Frank Hernandez here, and welcome to the Pest Geek podcast, bringing you the latest information on pests, products, and politics from today's leading industry sources to help you start, manage, and grow your pest control business.
Hey, welcome back. Welcome back to another edition of the Pest Geek podcast. I am your host, Frank Hernandez, here every day discussing all things pest. And I want to remind everybody to join the Pest Geek Society. Join the revolution of what's happening in the pest control industry. Join us on Facebook, Pest Geek Podcast Listeners Group. We're also on Twitter. We're on YouTube, pestgeekpodcast.com. Join us. Join in on the conversation. Let us know how we're doing. Let us know what you need to be more successful. Contribute, engage. And now here's Jeff McGovern with today's topic.
Well, thank you, Frank. I hope you folks are having a wonderful day today. And I thought I'd just get into a short discussion about ants, because I'm basically reviewing a house that was treated by pest control operators a few times for something as simple as crazy ants. And crazy ants get into just about everything. They drive the homeowners crazy. You know, it's not a major disaster along the lines of termites eating the house down or anything like that, but it upsets people. And they don't like to have ants in the house. In this particular case, the lady of the house is very much insect phobic. And so, you know, for her, the presence of those ants may be just as dangerous that causes her to panic. But at any rate, I looked back at the history of this. And I'm taking a look at the house right now, and if I go back to what we were dealing with in the past, it all started out with somebody power spraying the exterior of the home. And they were power spraying around the outside, and mind you, this isn't that big a home. It's actually up on piers. It's probably ground floor area of about 1,250 square feet, so it's not huge. And then it has a small second story above that. And the ants were getting into the second story into her workroom. And in this case, the lady happens to be very involved in sewing and things like that. And she would see the ants crawling around the windowsills and such around her very expensive sewing machines. So, that could get expensive as well, because my wife uses those machines as well. And yeah, if something gets into those electronics, I imagine that could be a problem. But let's back up to what was going on with the home. They were seeing the ants. Pest control operator came out and did the power spraying around the exterior. And then because the house, as I said, was up on piers, they did some spraying underneath. And it actually held it off for a little while. But they kept having to make what we termed extra service calls about every 2 weeks to bring people back out to go ahead and put more chemical into the house. And yeah, the housewife wasn't too thrilled with this as it was, because she didn't like insects and she wasn't really crazy about a bunch of excess pesticides in there. And they had, a couple young kids. She didn't want any exposure there. And pest control company said, okay, let's go ahead and use some dust materials in the walls. They did that. That didn't do any good much in the way of ants either. So that's about the time I was asked to take a look at it, friend of a friend kind of thing. And first thing I noticed was we had pathways. And what I mean by pathways are foliage around the outside of the house, tree limbs that are dipping down and touching the roof, palm trees laying up against the front of the house and leaning over onto the roof line on the front. Shrubbery was way too thick. It was against the house. Now, mind you, it wasn't messy. There was nothing wrong with the landscape. It was just a little bit too much. And I also noticed that in a lot of cases, there were two sides of the house where, frankly, it couldn't even breathe very well because the foliage was packed right up against the foundation. And even though it was pretty open, it was closing areas off and it was holding moisture up against those areas as well, which would have created an environment perfect for ants. So we took a stroll around the outside of the house. I remember that first visit I made. And of course, I checked with the housewife there, where was the last place you saw those ants? And she immediately took us to her sewing room on the second floor. Not a big area, but one that she had a workspace. And sure enough, there were those crazy ants on the windowsill and trailing down the edge of the wall. And she did make the comment that she had accidentally left some food out. She was snacking up there while she was working, and by God, they got into that as well. So I went ahead and did the investigation, and I noticed one of the areas the ants were getting into the house is they were actually going up and down the tree trunk of a tree adjacent to the house, and then there were a couple of branches that were lying on the roof, and the ants were bridging right over and trailing down from the roof into the top of that second story window. Okay, that's one area of entry, and we did some additional investigating. And there was a cable going up the outside of the house that was put there by the cable company to run lines upstairs so she could watch television. Well, sure enough, that cable started all the way down near one of the brick piers that the house is supported by. And the ants were trailing up the brick pier and then going right along the edge of that cable, stretched taut against the house, right against the siding, and making their way up the cable and then through the cable penetration in the wall and going right into that same room. So there were two entryways going into the structure. So we knew we had a problem there. So I said, well, Pest control company, have you guys tried any ways of drawing the ants out? Have you used any bait? And the operator, who's, by the way, a pretty good operator, he said, well, Jeff, we aren't really using any bait here. We didn't think it would be effective because the problem is just so many ants. We have to kill them. I said, well, let's back off on the spraying, because obviously it's not getting to where the insects are, and neither is the dust. And I don't necessarily recommend hosing the roof and the trees to get rid of these ants. So what we did was we took some 3x5 cards and we put some samples of bait products on those cards, and we continued our investigation. And we put those cards out on some windowsills where the ants were active, as well as a couple of spots on the outside. We found this activity where they were trailing toward the house, trying to climb up and down that cable. I actually slipped a 3x5 card under the edge with a few dabs of product on it. And lo and behold, after not more than about half an hour, we saw where the ants were getting into some of that product. And we had put some sample liquid product out as well, just some little droplets of product to see if we could attract them to those zones. Sure enough, the ants were active on that product, and they were also picking up the granulated product we had placed for the same purpose, to find out if they would take it. Instead of throwing it all over the place and trying out all these different things, we took some samples of all the products that the pest control operator had available to them, and thank goodness they had a buffet. We set up the buffet. Well, once we had established the insects were feeding, we went ahead and took some of the IBS stations, the ones made by VM Products, and we put material inside of those buffet style. Put some gel, put some liquid, put some dry material in the form of, actually in this particular case it was Niban. And we put all those products out, we put the stations out, we put one on a stake at the base of the tree where the ants were climbing. We placed some more of those around the outside, and then for the liquid bait, we took some of the Antopia stations and filled up those cylinders. We placed those as well. And then our plan was to come back the next day. And sure enough, when we came back the next day, do you know what? Those cylinders were completely empty. Ant activity was still pretty strong, and the cylinders were empty. And they had hammered a lot of the products in the IBS stations. They particularly liked the Niban. For some reason, they didn't take the gel. They took the liquid and they took the Niban, and we could actually see ants with little bits of Niban walking around with it. So we thought, aha, now we've identified something here. We found out what the food preference really is. Now, this was the morning after we had made the placements. And mind you, they wiped out those full cylinders of product. So I said, let's reload everything and we'll come back again tomorrow. Now, when you're working with ants, understand It's not just that little tiny ant. You have to think of it in terms of a big, huge animal with tentacles. Those ants, if they were all balled into one animal, would be pretty substantial in size with tentacles heading in every direction. We have to get enough toxicant into that animal to kill it. And so, obviously, what had been done in the past, the ants may have been wearing out the residual treatments. Even though we killed them by the thousands, they probably were just wearing it off. The dust that was put into the voids, they simply weren't going through those areas in the first place. But by identifying the travel paths and then identifying the product they were feeding on, we got them in this particular case. So we went ahead and reloaded everything and came back on the third day. Wasn't quite as much, but they had pretty well hammered them again. And what the pest control operator did was continue with his daily visits for just about 5 days. It was almost a week. And then he said the feeding went way down. So he backed it off. And what eventually happened was we killed off the colonies that were pressuring the property. You're not going to kill off everything in that whole section of town, but what we're trying to do is protect that property. And then eventually the pest control operator was able to get a little bit more targeted with his baiting because he found out what the patterns were, and he kept bait available actually a little farther out on the property line over by where their fences and such were, and he was able to corral those populations and keep them from pressuring the house again. Now, it takes a little more time to do it that way, but you know what? It worked, and he had an extremely satisfied client that understood what they were getting was frankly a whole bunch less hazardous for their family because it wasn't a bunch of stuff sprayed and hosed all over the place. And I'll tell you, just the sight of a pest control operator, even when they do it right, spraying around the outside of a home, freaks out some people. And we don't need to freak any folks out. In today's world, which is a litigation society, and people are told about how dangerous chemicals are, even when we're doing it right, it can be perceived as something bad. So at any rate, that's a little tale about ants. The investigative process, the buffet process, and the process toward getting a very satisfied client. So this is Jeff McGovern, the pest coach, and Frank, I will turn it back to you.
We hope you have enjoyed this edition of the Pest Geek Podcast. Until next time, have a pestacular day.
Thank you for listening to the Pest Geek Podcast. If you have enjoyed the Pest Geek Podcast, please give us a rating, write a review, or subscribe to the channel. You can join the Pest Geek Society by visiting pestgeekpodcast.com. Thank you for listening. See you next time.